Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Leah Markey, the director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's installment of Race and Dialogue, a conversation series from our center that features cross-generational discussions between scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and critical Indigenous studies. And I'm proud to state that this is our 9th conversation in the series. We're so honored to have two brilliant English professors with us today who are close colleagues and friends. The topic today is allyship, which is something quite dear to our heart in the Newberry's Ren Center. Today, you'll get the chance to learn from Professor Jean Howard from Columbia University and Professor Patricia Akhimie, who's been recently named the director of the Folger Institute at the Folger Shakespeare Library. And we're putting their websites into the chat now by way of introductions. And before they begin their conversation, I will read the Newberry's land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwa nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Maiamia, Wea, Sakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and life ways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it's the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose land we're situated. And since this is a virtual event, you all, our panelists and audience members, are joining us from many different places. Wherever you currently are, we encourage you to learn how you may be of service to people on whose lands you're situated and seek to understand your place within the history that has brought us to reside there. With that, I'll turn it over to Professors Howard and Akhimie. Thank you for being here today. And we'll start taking questions from the audience around 30 to 40 minutes into the conversation. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A at any point in the discussion, and we will start to collect them. Welcome, Jean and Patricia.
Hi.
Hi, Jean.
Hi, Patricia.
Well, okay, so I'm going to get the ball rolling, and I'm going to start by saying that Jean and I talked the other day, and I was saying that there's something a little strange for me about talking about allyship to begin with, and I was trying to figure out what that might be. And I think I realized it probably has something to do with frustration with the fact that allyship as a concept, as a practice, that it even needs to exist, is sort of points towards a much bigger and much longer problem. And that's hard. That's hard to sit with. But what I know is that allyship is important, even vital. And what I know is that it's a practice that I admire and one that I have seen modeled in you, Jean. And so I wanted to start by telling a story about the first time I met Jean Howard. So I was a graduate student at Columbia in the terminal master's program, and I went to the first day orientation session. And I was sitting there with my very good friend, Karen Emmerich, who's now also a faculty member. But she and I were sitting next to each other, and I remember feeling really intimidated, very nervous, not sure about what the future held for me as someone who aspired to be an academic. And then a faculty member popped their head in the door of the orientation session. And it was Jean. And Jean just said, she said hello. And she said that there were seats open in her seminar, which was like, it was on like gender and sexuality in the early modern world, something like that. And that's all. And she just said, you know, anybody's welcome to come. And she popped her head back out again. And even though at that time I was really sure that I wanted to study post-colonial poetry, for some reason I thought, I'm going to take that class. I'm going to take that class. And my friend Karen did too. And in retrospect, I realized that that was probably one of the first moments that I experienced the sort of direct result of Jean's brand of allyship, because there weren't any other faculty members who stopped by the graduate student orientation session to say, hey, this is the class I'm teaching next fall. You're welcome to join it. And also something about the way, something about the way she presented herself in the space made me know that I could take that class and that it would be valuable for me to do so. And then what I've learned over the long term is that that's sort of the tip of the iceberg of allyship. And I probably will never know all of the forms of allyship that Jean has embodied that have benefited me in rooms that I wasn't in and will never know about, and for which I'm very grateful. And for which, as somebody who I now aspire to be an ally in my own right, it's a model for me to follow. So thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Patricia.
And I'm going to be the interlocutor, and I'm going to ask you some questions, but I think this will be a sort of organic conversation, and I think that's right. So let's start with the obvious. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of the roles that, or the efforts that make up allyship, what are those for you?
Well, I think that it's easier to be an ally almost than to talk about it, because it can seem very smug or self-serving. I know how to be an ally. And being an ally is something you have to constantly rethink and redo, because you learn more. And some ways of connecting and supporting people, you learn there are better ways to do it. So it's like a moving target. But I do think there are some practices that you can sort of embody and that can become habitual. And it's a matter of intention and thoughtfulness. And some of the roles you're going to play as an ally, if you are like me, a teacher in a institution that trains graduate students, is as a graduate mentor. I think that's one of the most important roles, partly because, at least in elite institutions like the one I've been lucky enough to teach in, those are very white spaces. They remain white spaces. And so to help students navigate those spaces is a real challenge. And I just was so struck by a word you used when you first were speaking, Patricia, when you said, I was a terminal master's student. Oh my God. At some point in the past, Columbia talked about continuing master's students who are automatically in the PhD program, and then this awful word, terminal master's students. I mean, that is already sheep and goats. And of course, you didn't stay a terminal master's student, you became a full PhD student. We no longer use those terms, but that's just one of the many forms of sort of separating people invidiously that you have to be conscious of all the time. Linguistic practices, microaggressions, elisions, classes in which you never think will critical race studies scholarship be in this class? What way it will be in? How would it refigure the syllabus that I taught 5 years ago if I rethink it, right? Am I going to the BIPOC new scholars in the MA class and asking to meet them and seeing how their interests fit with you, with your interests? I mean, those are all things that are in the huge toolkit for good allyship if you're a graduate mentor ally. But also, another important role is in the early career years when people are getting established. And there's so many ways you can promote good students that might get overlooked for fellowships, for jobs, for being on panel sessions, for being nominated for prizes. There are so many places where if you just think a little bit, you can promote students in those early years, which are the formative years for getting tenure, maybe moving up a notch from one institution to another, getting the crucial fellowship year that lets you say, finish your book and have a baby. I mean, there are, all kinds of things that those early years challenges that you can help with. I think the third role I think about is institutional change agent. And this is much less about a one-on-one relationship with a person as it is about transforming spaces where many people will be, and more people, you hope, who are diverse. And that can mean anything from changing the curriculum in your department so that there are more classes that meet the needs of diverse students, to advocating for more faculty hires in specific areas. It can mean institutionalizing offices and programs that help to foster the well-being of diverse members of a community. And one thing that I think you learn as you go along is that you have to use what prestige you have very carefully but forcefully. At one point, I was a vice provost for diversity at Columbia, and I had this advisory committee of Black and Latinx and Indigenous and white scholars. And we talked about how would we change the needle at Columbia? I mean, how would we make it better? How would we get more people hired? And one of the things we decided was that presentations to search committees and to faculty chairs should not be done by diversity officers. They should be done by faculty, the most prestigious faculty we could get of all races. And people who were willing, they'd written 5 books, but they were willing to say words like white privilege, institutional racism, microaggressions. I mean, they were willing to use their prestige to instruct their colleagues about practices that were impeding the progress of many members of the community. And, that was a very successful tactic. And people have to be willing to use whatever prestige they accrue, to help in those efforts. And they have always to consult with critical race scholars about what are the tactics and the goals that are best. Just charge out all by yourself. But anyway, those are some of the roles I think about as being part of being an ally when you're in an educational institution.
I have to say, so I think that's really, really helpful for our audience. But I want to chime in and say that all that time, so when you were vice provost for diversity at Columbia, all that time, we had made a deal that I would come to your office every week and give you 5 new pages of my dissertation.
Yes.
So I don't want our audience to misunderstand that these forms of allyship were layered on top of one another. So I had no idea what you were doing when you were in the office of the vice provost of diversity, but I did know that every week I had to come and sit in your office and show you 5 new pages, many of which were not very good. And I just really appreciated that you were willing to read them anyway. And it's only on reflection that I realized how many layers of allyship you were undertaking at that time. I'll also say that, so you mentioned the way courses are structured or restructured. And when we first started working together, Premodern Critical Race Studies did not have that name and was not the field that it is today. But when I took that first class as a terminal master student, we met Kim Hall. Not only did we read her work, but she came to the classroom and talked with us. We met Valerie Traub, who I think is here in the audience today, and she came and gave a talk, The Joys of Martha Joyless. So we were reading some incredible scholarship and talking with the scholars who were doing it. And what I understand now is that you were taking this group of students, including me, a terminal master's student who ostensibly had no future as an academic, and taking us to the cutting edge of what was happening in early modern studies. And so I just want to give full color to that part of your allyship.
Well, I think sometimes people think that all the benefit flows in one direction. It does not. Being in conversation with Kim Hall and Valerie Traub was what kept my intellectual life alive. And there is this incredible sense that when you know these new fields of knowledge and you allow yourself to sort of take them on, your own intellectual life just becomes better and better. And so there is a kind of virtuous circle here of, mutuality. And it was such a wonderful thing for me to have Kim eventually come to Barnard across the road and become the co-director of your dissertation and many other dissertations that came out of Columbia at a time when it was just so important to have Kim as an ally nearby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a really important. I think that's a really important aspect, because you've talked about sort of the institutional forms of allyship, and then your sort of role as a teacher mentoring students. One of the other things that you did for me, and I think for other scholars, was you introduced me to Kim Hall. I didn't know who she was, or I had never met her, and you arranged like a lunch. And so I got to meet Kim Hall at the Kitchenette Uptown in like the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And what a life-changing encounter that was for me, and the first of many, meetings with Kim Hall. But that you understood that brokering that meeting was crucial for a student of color in a program and in a field that was demographically very white. And that is, to me, to this day, amazing. Thank you for that.
Well, when I came to Columbia, I had the great good luck. And again, this is where in sort of bonds of trust build on one another. Phyllis Rackin at Penn had Kim as a student, and she suggested that Kim come and do her Ford postgraduate year at Columbia with me as her quote sponsor and mentor. Well, this was just the greatest thing that ever happened, because I'm not sure I helped Kim all that much, but she did help me then and forever after. But I remember she was working on Things of Darkness, and I remember sitting in our living room, and she was putting on the wall of the living room the portraits that were going to be studied in that last chapter, and we would be sitting there talking about the pearls and why did all these white women have Black servants. And it was just such a fabulous experience for me. It really in part started my journey into what I now call critical race studies, but didn't know that's what it was then. And it was just transformative to be involved at that point. I could help Kim some because I was a more senior scholar at that point, like with letters and whatnot, but it was such a mutual helping.
So allyship comes with allies.
It does, absolutely. But it's also intergenerational. Phyllis was older than I was and had a long, distinguished career at Penn. So, she kind of passed Kim along a chain. Yeah. Yeah.
So here's a question.
Okay.
When do you think allyship starts? So does it start when you're the vice provost of diversity? This is a trick question. When does it start really?
Well, if you're an academic, I'm always answering here within the academic framework. It starts with your fabulous undergraduates. And, I see in a very hopeful way, I see many of my students struggling to learn how to be good allies with the increasingly varied classmates that they have. People with who are racially different from them, who come from different class backgrounds, who are queer, who are trans, and many of them are really wanting to productively be allies with a great range of people. And so you can kind of help to choreograph as a teacher kinds of encounters and experiences in the classroom that will help them to try out things. You can put them in learning groups that are very mixed and give them assignments that are collective rather than individual, where you invite and encourage modes of working together and different skill sets being put together. And, so it begins by fostering forms of allyship. And I don't mean just uncritical. I mean, often there's critique and criticism, but hopefully constructive, with a goal of creating better work when we realize the limitations of what we've been doing. So it starts, for me, it always starts in the undergraduate classroom, which is always such a place of pleasure and a little peril. It wouldn't be really good if it weren't a little perilous, where you try to push them to interact in new ways and to take on new fields of knowledge. And of course, then it goes to the graduate level. We've already really talked about that. So, and then it begins in your department, learning to figure out how could this department, which is my space of work, be the best intellectual and personal space for the well-being of everybody in it. And then, maybe you become an institutional player at a larger scale in your institution, your professional organizations, whatever. So it's everywhere. But there are a lot of dimensions.
But let's talk about, so you mentioned peril. And let's talk a little bit about that, because that's the other side of allyship. So what happens when you mess up and you make a mistake? Then what do you do?
Well, if you really have made a mistake, you acknowledge it and try to figure out how not to make it again and how to do better. I think you just take on board that it is impossible not to make mistakes, and you try to keep moving and not get stuck. And, it's easier if when you make a mistake, the critique that has called that mistake into question doesn't happen on a digital platform, but happens face to face or in a letter or some way that there's a way forward to different behaviors rather than a kind of cancellation of the person who made the mistake. I'm just not a Calvinist. I don't believe there are any perpetual reprobates. So yeah, when you make a mistake, and you have to acknowledge it and try to change your practice, whatever it was that wasn't right, that you didn't get right, and that you make it again. You'll make some mistake again. That's what we think we have to all kind of acknowledge. And this has become an area of real peril when people are calling out people not with the intent necessarily of allowing growth and change and collective movement forward, but to sort of silence people. And that's I think, very pernicious to intellectual life as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Intellectual life has a lot of criticism in it. It does. But it doesn't have to be destructive, I don't think.
I would agree. Yeah. And we were talking about the other day how difficult it can be sometimes to balance wanting to kind of leave that path forward open, but also to keep scholars of color safe. So that puts you in really difficult positions sometimes. And we also, I want to say, just for the record, we were talking the other day and I was like, Jean, have you ever made a mistake? And you were like, yes. And I was like, I have also made a mistake. I want to say that out loud here for the benefit of our audience. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't not, right? But how do you work from the mistake forward? That's the question.
Yeah. Exactly. So here's another version of the same question in a way. How do you know that you've done a good job? How do you know you got an A in allyship?
You don't know often. You just don't know. And that's kind of like an existential commitment you make to try. And sometimes people will tell you that was good. You know, you got something changed. I got a fellowship. Yay. You know, sometimes you can sense that your efforts have borne fruit. And sometimes you need to ask people, you know, you need to ask your allies, maybe your critical race studies allies, you know, has this been effective? What else could I be doing? If you're not sure that you're being effective, then you need to ask.
You know, when you were, I can't remember which SAA the panel, the color of the membership was, but I remember going to that session and it being really clear to me at that moment the magnitude of the forms of allyship that must have been underway and for how long in order for a panel session like that to have been proposed, accepted, and to happen in front of a full audience. I know, okay, it must have been Atlanta because Pat Cahill was you and you were not there because a tornado kept you from coming. Yes.
I was in Pittsburgh with my paper, very sad for 3 nights and couldn't get out. And Pat Cahill, a former student, read my paper. I'm sure she read it better than I would have. But yes, she's a real ally. Yeah, I wish I had been there for that panel, but that's all right. I heard all about it.
It was an extraordinary moment, maybe even more so because there was someone to step up to the mic in your place to fill that role. That's so pretty amazing. Is a pretty amazing benchmark, I think, for that organization.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. We're coming closer to the time for Q&A, but let me maybe ask one more question.
Yes.
Things change. The terminology we use, and even more fundamentally, the specific needs of the people who we seek to be in allyship with change over time. And we hope to be an ally for our whole careers, for our whole lives, how do you know when things have changed and how do you adapt to those changes so that what would have been helpful, 5 years ago is now maybe hurtful? How do you know that? And how do you change with the times?
I think there are a lot of ways you sort of change with the times. One, you keep reading. Think of the torrent of critical race studies scholarship that's come out in the last 5 years. I haven't read every bit of it, but I have read as much as I possibly can. And that's the first thing. Then you know how things are changing because you've actually read the work. That's how you know the intellectual field is changing. You sometimes don't just rely on the scholarship that's published, but on podcasts where people are speaking more informally, or something like this dialogue series where I learn a lot. I've learned a lot about teaching from sitting in on many of these webinars that the Folger's done and the Newberry's now doing. So, and there people speak more anecdotally about what has been helpful or hurtful to them in changing circumstances. And then you ask people, again, you talk with people. I mean, one of my lifelong interlocutors is Kim, and we talk a lot about what's changing. And, everybody has to find their own close-up interlocutors. So there are a lot of ways that you can sort of, you'll never be perfectly caught up. You'll never be perfect, but there's certainly ways to sort of learn what's different and how to change. There's research on this stuff. I read so much research when I was the vice provost, research about how bias works and why is it that if you don't put screens up in front of people auditioning for major orchestras, they always choose the men. If you put screens up, they choose women in equal numbers. I mean, there is just so much stuff to know if you want to know it. Yeah.
There's probably something to be said about being someone who enjoys that journey also, that there's so much to learn. In a way, it's an extension of your scholarship to be always learning.
Well, it's an extension of intellectual life as I know it. Why do we go to be university professors? Because it's the best life in many ways in order to sort of be really alive over decades. And people who don't enjoy that journey, I don't know why they become professors. It's one of the great privileges of the academic life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jean, do you have any questions before we ask the audience if they have questions?
Well, I did want to ask from the critical race scholars study perspective, what you think are the three most important qualities of good mentorship and good allyship. What would you say? What have you benefited most from? What would you like to see more of?
Okay, so this isn't a question that I've had thought about in advance. So I'm just speaking off the cuff. But the first thing that comes to mind is I remember going to a big conference and I went to see a panel session and Margot Hendricks was giving a talk. That's why I wanted to go. And you were sitting there. I think we were both sitting in the same room. We may have been sitting there together, but it was very important for me that we kind of made a habit of finding a way to spend time together at SAA, even long after I had been a York graduate student and had left Columbia. I think a really important form of allyship that might get overlooked is just being there, like being there physically in person, which can be very difficult to do. And I'm so grateful that I think at every SAA I've been to, you've been there. Like we had beignets in New Orleans. Like I can remember every SAA. Right. I can remember encountering you there. But I think what's important to articulate is that form of support of being physically present was its own form of allyship that I benefited from. Because it meant that even in some spaces that weren't particularly safe, SAA in particular, at times, you represented that safety, or at least the promise of that safety. And in the years I've been going to SAA and seeing you there, that organization and that experience has changed quite a bit. So there was an arc towards positive change, which I benefited from, I'm sure, allyship that happened behind the scenes, but also just you being there. So I think, being able to accompany a scholar who is benefiting from your allyship into some of those spaces that could be intimidating or worse sometimes, that is its own form of allyship, and it's a really important one.
Accompaniment is one of those theoretical words that we don't pay enough attention to. Yeah. Accompanying. Yeah, it's a very powerful concept. Not speaking for you, not doing anything, just accompanying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. In fact, the first time I gave a talk myself at SAA, you appeared suddenly in front of my microphone, and
what did I do?
You just came to say hello and wish me luck. But you sort of like appeared suddenly, and it was both like alarming and comforting at the same time.
Don't remember that one.
That was a sort of like Jean is always there.
Right.
Yes. I think another form of allyship that is useful to talk about, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, the ways in which allyship, or maybe the social forces that mean that allyship is important, are intersectional. That's a lot of our conversations were as much about racial diversity as about class, like what to wear. The first time I had to negotiate a salary, that you were the person that I called because I knew I could have that conversation with you. I think there's a sort of unspoken reality of our profession that there are expectations about presentation and about class. And I think you knew, and good allies know, that the fact of that intersectionality can be particularly debilitating, and that's a place to be available and address in whatever way you can. I think the form of allyship that you described, and that to me is perhaps the most impactful, having a long-lasting impact, is the allyship at an institutional level. And there was something you said the strategy that you had come up with your team to have distinguished faculty members give the presentations on diversity rather than a diversity officer, knowing that would help the message to land, and it would help change to come. That kind of insight, and then being able to enact it in an institution that might be unwilling or unable at sometimes to aid you, I think for me that's a very powerful form of allyship. And I think it's one that, and you said this as well, probably goes unrecognized the most. So I don't know if anybody has before today, if you've ever talked about, this strategy. And so I think being willing to do that work, and being willing to do it in the absence of any accolades, any line on your CV, even anyone knowing that that's what you've done behind the scenes, that's a pretty powerful thing.
I want to say, be sure I underline that strategy, which I think was very successful, was collectively derived. We had to have many people in the room. We wanted buy-in from everybody, and then we went forward with it. And I don't know, I would have come up with it so clearly on my own. I don't know that. So it's just, there's great power in collectivity, right? And yeah, and intersectional analysis, and the bringing together of those different aspects of people's professional lives and social being. When I entered the academy, there were no women to speak of. There were no maternity policies. That's when my first struggles really began. When I had my 2 children, I didn't have any maternity leave, so it's sort of, you accumulate like a snowball, layers of consciousness around class and around gender, around race, around disability, and those are all part of our embodied and intellectual lives.
Yeah. Jean, I think we should make time for questions. I see Leah is popping up there. So.
All right, Leah.
Hi, thanks for this incredible conversation. We've really been enjoying it. I thought I'd pose a question as our audience is developing their own. And I know we at the Newberry would love to hear your thoughts on allyship outside the academy. What can libraries and museums do to contribute? And I'm sure, Patricia, this is something you're thinking about quite a bit now at the Folger. And in some ways, I feel we have a little bit more flexibility outside academia, but there are other institutional challenges. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, Patricia, go ahead.
Okay, because I have a good story about that. I have a good Jean story about that.
Oh, no.
I think the first time I went to the Folger, I was a graduate student and I was taking a seminar led by Kim Hall. I was super excited about it. And when you get to the Folger, this is how it used to be. When you got to the Folger, they would register you as a reader. But to be registered as a reader, you needed a letter of reference. And so I had my letter of reference with me, which was a letter that Jean wrote for me in a fancy envelope and everything, because this was pre-digital letters. And the registrar was sitting there in front of me and opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. And I realized it was multiple pages long, like more than two, maybe. Like it's a very long letter for a graduate student. But in that moment, I realized a couple of things. I thought, oh, that's the level of vetting that is maybe expected here at the Folger or at similar libraries. And I have the extreme privilege of having an advisor who knows that and knew not just to write me a letter, but to write me like a 3-page letter explaining why I was qualified to be present at the Folger. And nowadays, if you've applied for Folger fellowships, you know that the letters are optional. You can apply with one letter, you can apply with 2 letters, you can apply with no letters. And that, I think that change has come in response to the fact that particular hoop to jump through could have stopped me or many other people at the door. And now it doesn't. So I feel like the letter of recommendation, it hasn't gone away forever, and there are other forms of vetting that we use, but that seems like a really important example of how things have changed, I think, for the better.
Okay, thanks so much. That's good to hear. I didn't know this about the letters too, so something to keep in mind. Okay, we have a couple questions coming in. This one's from Crystal Bartolovich. I was at Socialism 2023 a couple of weeks ago, and a young Black woman working with a political organization commented after the abolition communism session that she was personally finding solidarity the hardest thing to achieve at the moment, which many agreed about. But they were not talking about academia or even individual interactions, but in movements. And I'm wondering how the fascinating and brilliant things that have been talked about today translate to movements. She says, I guess this is related to Leah's question too.
Well, I'll take a little bit of a stab at that. I don't think there's any automatic transfer. And I think we've been speaking about academic institutions pretty much today and forms of allyship within that sphere. And I do think that it's difficult work in academia, but we have progressed a certain part of the path. It's harder in social movements because it's just a different scale. And often you're working within one sphere. You're working in Black Lives Matter. And we see schisms within Black Lives Matter. We see schisms not only between social movements, but within them. And I think Crystal's right that one of the contemporary biggest challenges is to keep a progressive alliance some way alive in our minds, and to develop practices that allow us to speak across the differences. And at any historical conjuncture, there are going to be certain prioritized struggles. They just probably have to be that way. But there has to be some way of keeping alive a sense that we have to attend to the mutual struggles whenever we can, and to see where they intersect. And partly being a Marxist, among other things, I do believe there are intersections. And I don't think we've been very good as a culture, maybe as an academy, about pointing to those intersections. Marxism is about much more than class relations. and it has a lot, racial capital has a lot to teach us, as does Marxist feminism. But I think we have not yet in the public sphere figured out a way to achieve the solidarity which is there on the horizon that we would like to develop for a more productive politics in the largest sphere. You know, you read about Kevin McCarthy this morning in news, threatening to resign, and it's just the complete dysfunction of our political system. And it does make you rather despairing.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something to be said, something that's sort of difficult to say, I think, that for scholars of color in academia, even just the effort to try to succeed and sustain a career can sometimes be so difficult that it might even preclude your ability to participate actively in movements outside of academia. But I feel like part of what we're talking about today in terms of allyship is one of the benefits of receiving strong allyship, being the beneficiary of strong allyship, is maybe receiving the space and the time and the emotional energy capability to pursue activism. When you feel like it's not just about, can I survive this semester? Can I get a job? Can I keep it?
That's a great point. And which kind of leads to a great question we have from an anonymous participant here, who simply asks, what can someone do if they don't feel like they have any support? How can someone find an ally without feeling like a burden?
I guess it's
an honest question. Yeah. Jean,
well,
you go.
I think this is a really important question and a hard one. You know, if we're talking about an academic context, then you look outside the box you were put in. If you were put in a small department and you don't see any support with faculty or fellow students, for example, or junior faculty, then you have to go to another unit. I mean, I survived the early days at Columbia by having the Gender Institute as a separate home. If I just lived in English at Columbia for the first few years I was there, I would have been very unhappy and shriveled up. And it was having this other space that you have to go and find and cultivate. I mean, there always are alternative spaces where you can develop, I think, allies. So you have to go searching for them if they're not present in your view. It also is very intellectually liberating to be thinking outside the paradigms of an academic space that to you feels deadening and confining or unwelcoming. Then find a better space, and you'll either be able to thrive in that second space and leave the first, or you'll come back to the first space with renewed energy for remaking it and cultivating within it some forms of allyship. Yeah, that's the best I can do with a difficult problem. Yeah, the smaller the unit you're in, the more chances are that can happen.
I would add to that. I think, and I don't think this is fair, but I think this is what happens. I think, especially to scholars of color, is that in the absence of support, you may find yourself compelled to become a support for someone else. That is, to sort of embody the practice that you hope one day you will be the beneficiary of. And I say that from experience, that finding yourself in a place that is sort of a resource desert, in which you are looking and searching for the kind of support you need and not finding it. What I found myself doing was looking for other people who might need my support. And even though that didn't necessarily give me the allyship that I was looking for in my own institution for myself. It was a way to train myself in how to perform that for other people, and then how to recognize what I needed when it did come. And it did come eventually.
And also, you can use networking possibilities outside your institution. That's why things like the SAA and the RSA are important. I mean, as totalities, they may not be totally welcoming, but within them, there are many places where you can meet people who share your intellectual interests and your personal struggles. And that's why going to conferences is so crucial early in your career, to meet a network that's not tied to one site. And the smaller the site you come from, the more you're going to need those bigger organizations to help you. And libraries that give, dissertation fellowships, boy, are they important spaces, right? And many libraries do community outreach work. I'm looping back to another moment in our conversation. That's extremely important too, for people who find themselves in situations outside the academy, but they want to find their allies within it. And that's a way they first get their pathway into those conversations. So public programming is important.
Yeah, we definitely hope to be a place of refuge at the Newberry. I'm sure the Folger as well. We have time for, I think, one or two more questions here. So another anonymous question: how do you navigate around people who seem more interested in being seen as an ally versus actually doing the work? This is a big question. Is there a way to help guide them to be more productive allies, accomplices, or should we just learn the difference and stay away from those folks? So
Another good, honest question.
yeah.
Jean, do you want to take that one first? I'm thinking about a diplomatic way to answer. Yes.
I'll say one or two things, and that is, if you see such people and they seem to be doing it all the time, I would just not include them in various activities that I was going to participate in. However, you could go and talk to them and tell them what you see. Now, it's all about power relations. It depends on if you're a lowly graduate student and this is a senior professor, you might not want to do that. But, feedback, telling people that this behavior is not helpful and that there are these three things that would be very helpful is sometimes good. Sometimes people actually don't know. You give them the benefit of the doubt. And usually you can sense when it's people who really don't know versus people who are just in there to grab some glory and do no work. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But power relations are at play in everything. And you have to be aware of what you can say from a certain vantage point and what might hurt you to say. Mm-hmm. Tenured people could say whatever they want and should. Right.
Maybe one last question here. So both of you have, and this is sort of a reframing of a question, an anonymous question. Both of you have experience with academic publishing as writers and editors. And how can scholars, and white scholars in particular, be good allies in this space? So just thinking also in terms of publishing, what do you feel the role is?
That's a good question. That's a Jean question.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're a white scholar, one of the things you can do is to keep up with the scholarship in critical race studies and disability studies and indigenous studies in your field, so that when you're asked to do manuscripts and review them, you're competent to do it, that you don't give dated advice or stupid advice because you don't know the field, and also that you don't have to say no. Mm-hmm. Responsibly. If you don't know the field, you have to say, I can't review this. But if you have tried to be in the field and know it, you can, help good books get published. And so that's, I think, the first thing I would say is, if you want to help, you have to keep up, because otherwise your advice isn't going to be very useful to presses or to the authors, right? And it's easier for some people than others to keep up. I'm very aware I'm in a research one place where we're supposed to keep up, right? But it's also a conscious choice that I will read in these areas as well as those areas I've read in before. Yeah. And you can help your junior colleagues and your graduate students publish. You can help them the first time in particular, just if they're making an argument for Shakespeare Quarterly or Wren drama or whatever it is. What does such an argument have to look like in the field? I'm not saying you do your critical race studies work, but what is it that makes a good argument? How do you use evidence? How do you just all the things that we are supposed to be teaching? But it is a little different when it's an article for the first time rather than a seminar paper. It's another step up in complexity and accountability to the field. Citation, very important. It's very important to cite other critical race scholars in the area you're going into. It's very important to cite white allies and precursors in the field, even when they didn't know what the term critical race studies meant. They're just things that you can do to prepare students to be publishers, and that's important. And then you also are a vetter of work, and you have to be ready to vet the work well and responsibly and say yes when people ask you. I mean, journals right now are crying and presses for people to read books. There's a big backlog at many journals because no one will say yes to reading things. So it's part of the obligation to the future of the profession to say yes and to be prepared when you say yes to be able to do good readings. Yeah. I mean, they're unrewarded. Nobody pays you basically for doing any of that work, but the field won't have a future if you don't do it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I feel like we'd be remiss also, Jean, if we didn't talk about your leadership of the Race Before Race Second Book Institute, which has been amazing. But what's interesting is how unusual it is. So there are very few forms of support for people writing a first book and certainly not for a second book in Premodern Critical Race Studies. And you took on the work of leading that. It's sort of like a combination between a workshop and like maybe like a support group kind of, but it's about navigating the challenges of writing, period, in the midst of other parts of your career that you're juggling, and then writing in this field in particular. I want to make sure you get credit for your amazing work there.
Well, thank you. I will say it's one of the best intellectually exciting undertakings I've done. I had to learn a lot of new things because people weren't even all from English. So there was much to learn, which was part of what made it very exciting work to do.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful, inspiring conversation, and thanks everyone for being here. Our next conversation is in the spring, featuring Brian Keene and Andrea Akhimie, and they'll be talking about PCRS, global medieval art, and the role of museums, and that's actually scheduled for April 5th. And we also want to remind you all that these conversations are on YouTube. This one will be up soon, and you share it with all your friends and colleagues. It's great to have an archive of these incredible dialogues. And also, we want to put in a blatant plug for our exhibition, which is up through December 30th at the Newberry Sing Race Before Race. And we hope you all can come see us and see the exhibition. We're happy to give you a tour if you're in the area. So thank you so much. Thanks so much, Patricia and Jean.
Thank you.